Gregor Murray here from Université Montréal and the CRIMT partnership. And in exchanging with our colleagues who were organizing this year's Canadian Industrial Relations Association, we said, what a great opportunity to do some brainstorming around better and worse work, which is a central concern for so many of us. And we organized a first roundtable at 8:30 this morning with 4 participants speaking in French. And now we're doing this second roundtable with 4 other participants speaking in English. And we're drawing on an international roster. So going from east to west, we have Valeria Pulignano from Leuven University and a CRIMT affiliated researcher. Then going to East Anglia, we have Olga Tregaskis at the University of East Anglia, also a CRIMT affiliated researcher. We have Matt Johnson moving up to the Northwest in Manchester at the University of Manchester. And also he should currently be in Montreal, but COVID has dictated otherwise. So we hope to see him sometime soon. And then moving out to the West Coast, we always have our cleanup hitter, which is Jim Stanford, very much a friend and an affiliated researcher and collaborator, who I hope I get the title right, the Center for Future Work. And amongst other things, Jim has recently published a really interesting report on worker voice and all its dimensions and exploring the case in Canada in particular. Now, our panelists are all delightful individuals, so I kind of asked them in a vague kind of way if you can do this. And then they say yes, and then the creative tension begins to build, because then I give them a set of very ornery questions, but don't ask for any precisions on their part, so that this creative tension continues to build. They say themselves, what the heck am I going to do in response to these questions? And probably they were still thinking about it as they awoke this morning or went to sleep last night. To be fair, some I think it's easier, and I don't want to prejudge, but for people who are actually working on particular types of work or trades like Matt and Valeria, perhaps you can draw on your research work. This is maybe the case with Valeria. Jim, I gave him an out and I said, anything you want to say about expressiveness at work or anything else will be great. So we'll see how it works out. From the previous panel, there is a slight tendency to want to talk about the breadth, depth, and interest of your research in response to the first question, which is meant to be a teaser. So, you know, like when you go to a restaurant and they give you a teaser, they're not supposed to serve the vegan pie at the same time. So if we can use the first question just as kind of a warm up, and then you'll know that you'll have time in subsequent questions to do what you want to develop. So we're going to use the same format as in the previous round table. And we have a series of questions drawing on a kind of a template that we've used to say, how might we think about work as it progresses in time? It's perturbed or disrupted, subject to re-regulation, and how do we think about how to make it better or worse and why it is better or worse? So the warm-up question was and is, drawing on a particular aspect of your research, briefly identify what makes work better or worse. So keep it simple. We said 2 minutes. Of course, it will be more than 2 minutes. We know that in putting it forward. But do you want to start on this, Olga? We're going to keep mixing up the order just to keep you on your toes.
Oh, good. That's fine. Mix up the order. So I'll go first this time, because this is a nice, easy one. So introductions. Yeah, I want to kind of draw on the experiences of some work that we're doing looking at health and well-being of workforce alongside productivity demands in the workplace. So I'm coming at it very much from a worker health and well-being perspective that focuses on psychological understanding of well-being and better work. So understanding worse work, I suppose, in terms of things like captured through burnout, through aspects of emotional exhaustion, depersonalisation, restricted personal achievement in the workplace, characteristics like overload, intensification, poor social relationships, senses of isolation or anxiety. So how would work might create that sense of those feelings, of those reactions amongst the workforce. The more positive side, of course, is how the work might actually support that more eudaimonic aspects of well-being, so that kind of sense of purpose. It's meaningful. It has an impact, which is a positive impact on the individual and those around the individual. So that's what I'm going to try and pick up a little bit and tease out later on. Back to you.
Thanks very much. And can I just check with Geneviève of our tech support how the quality of Olga's sound is for her next intervention and whether we need to do something?
Maybe if you have microphone, you can use it. Otherwise, I don't think I can do much for the sound.
Maybe just closer to the computer if you can on the next intervention. I think we got it, but it was a little harder. Why don't we go over to Matt now? And Matt, your teaser on what makes work better or worse?
Yeah,
in the light of your research.
Yeah, thank you, Gregor. Yeah, I mean, I kind of preface this by saying that I'm in a kind of transitional period, if you like, in terms of the work I'm doing. So I'm coming off the back of having done quite a bit of work on precarious work, low wage work, outsourcing, and moving into another project which is looking at decent work and kind of city initiatives around decent work. And I think what my reflections have been on spanning those two areas, if you like, is that in and amongst some of those kind of long range discussions about kind of productivity, decent work, future of work, digitalization, a lot of what I'm really interested in actually comes down to fairly mundane everyday things. You know, it's kind of improving the material conditions of work, whether that's through regulations on wages or working time. So it's those more kind of practical short-term things. I think that's what I've kind of taken from a lot of the work that I've done. So those improvements that might seem relatively marginal, but do make a significant difference to improve the stock of low wage jobs that provide a platform for increased enhanced social protection, kind of encouraging employees to think more creatively about job design. How do they kind of develop career paths for low wage workers? So it's those more kind of mundane things, I guess, which I keep coming back to. And
I'm going to ask if we don't have a long way to go in that respect.
Yeah, I think we do. I think that's what kind of COVID has highlighted, hasn't it? The future of work has come kind of screeching into view. The big debates about digitalization and just transitions, and we're still talking about people not being paid a living wage. You know, there's a real kind of, for me, there's a big gap there, isn't there, between those transformative agendas and the kind of the here and now.
And if we go over to you on this one, Jim, and you had many different jobs and spent most of your life representing workers and about improving their jobs.
Yeah, thanks, Gregor, and thank you for pulling this session together. It's a wonderful cross-section of people. I'm really glad to meet you all. I was often asked when we were doing work around good jobs, you know, the campaign for good jobs, how do you define a good job? And my favorite kind of simple, practical definition, a good job is a job that treats you like a human being rather than a disposable productive input. And that lens, you know, when you think it through, kind of opens up all kinds of dimensions and criteria that I think are relevant. Obviously, the fact that it recognizes you are a human being, not a machine doing the job. So you have to have safety and comfort and sustainability in the working conditions that you're inhabiting. As a human being, you have other things going on in your life, not just the job. So you have to have a combination of sort of stability and predictability in your working arrangements and schedules, but also flexibility. that allows you to balance your job with those other responsibilities. And it's complicated, that mixture, that combination of stability and flexibility. We often think of jobs as either, fixed or flexible, some kind of one-dimensional scale, and that's absolutely wrong. We need a bit of both, and both employers and workers want stability, and both of them want flexibility, but they want it in different ways. And who gets to determine what flexibility means is critical, especially how just the buzzword flexibility gets thrown around so much these days. Compensation in terms of earning a living, obviously a living wage, it has to be adequate, but hopefully more than that in the long run in terms of sharing in the prosperity that labor produces. And then something about your status and rights as a human being to have a say, to be heard, to express your views, to be represented in a workplace. I'm always amazed that we live in, more or less democratic societies, but most of us just implicitly expect that we will check our democratic rights at the door when we enter the workplace. And if we are human beings, then of course we want to say in how things go, including where we spend, probably the biggest part of our waking hours in our lives. So all of those things contribute to the fact that you're a full-fledged human being at the workplace, not just a producer.
Thank you, Jim. And that sounds like a pretty good entry for you, Valeria.
Yes, thank you very much also for inviting me. It's very nice to see all of you and to meet back with some that I already knew. So yes, I think it's a very good link to what I'm doing at the very moment. So looking at bad and good jobs, well, for me, looking particularly at precarious work is really looking at bad jobs. But what actually I'm most interested in and what I see as really bad at the very moment is this kind of growing of unpaid areas of work, which in fact affects a lot the life and the work of people, because what we are trying to do in the research that I'm trying to carry on at the very moment is to link the way in which this kind of unpaid work account for precarious and precariousness, but also looking at it in a kind of intersection between work and life of people, which means in fact between home and work. So what we are arguing is that all this kind of unpaid work which is done and which makes the life of people and the work of people very difficult also has a lot of implications, very perverse implications also for families. So it's not only work and workers who are precarious, but also families and households are becoming more and more precarious. And the question is, what is a kind of a sustainability here that we are talking about, particularly within societies. So yes, again, I mean, going back to the question that you posed, Gregor, in terms of what makes jobs bad, well, a lot of things at the macro level, all the kind of transformation that we have been facing, and weakening of traditional collective institutions for employment protections, which has in fact increased precarious works enormously by in fact increasing employers' discretion in wage determination, particularly in working conditions and work organizations and so forth. The removal of various forms of labor regulations, which has in fact allowed employers to instigate this kind of flexible scheduling that we all know, and also the role of the state in that, in kind of pushing for active labor market policies and all this kind of workfare. But also, I would say, what all these kind of macro level transformations are creating in terms of jobs, in terms of the kind of working conditions of people, and how these, in fact, as I said before, impacts upon the families and the households and domestic labor particularly as well. So, and I would just close here.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a great kickoff for what's good and what's bad, and we have no illusions that things are necessarily becoming better all the time. Indeed, things seem to be going in the reverse for a number of reasons that you identified, but it's very important to understand the dynamics of this. And one of the ways that we thought we could do this, and we've been working on this kind of framework of saying, okay, let's take a job or a sector or a company or an industry where the quality of work has become an issue, and try and draw a timeline between time 0, which is the time you want to start, and time 2, where there's been some form of experimentation, which could be for the good, or it could be neoliberal for the bad, and then taking it through to what's been the impact of this re-regulation in terms of results and why. And I think I'll start with Matt here. So it's probably better to take something specific if you can and not speak to all your research, but you're going to do what you're going to do based on the creative tension that I mentioned. And I've been remiss in not telling people that there is simultaneous translation available here. You just have to click on the bottom of the screen. Alors, si vous voulez écouter en français, c'est disponible aussi. So go ahead, Matt.
Thank you. So I'll focus in specifically on outsourcing of public services. So this is local or municipal authorities, so the kind of the local state level, the city level, if you like. And I won't kind of recount the entire history of outsourcing here, but I guess T0 here would be somewhere in the 1980s, really, when you start to see this first significant wave of outsourcing. So that in itself was a institutional experimentation. It was kind of fragmenting existing services. It was fragmenting collective bargaining structures. The rules around public procurement were being kind of rewritten quite quickly to prevent certain forms of labour standards being upheld. So you had all this kind of legal reform, legal experimentation going on as well. So that was the kind of the start point for this. And you start to see services going out to the market. So waste services, highways, building maintenance, and more latterly social care. So that was kind of one of the big cost burdens for municipal government in the UK, certainly. So they were trying to get that out to the market as quick as they possibly could to save on labour costs. So through the kind of 1990s and into the 2000s, and you really start to see the adverse outcomes of that. So market competition, hardly any trade union penetration in the privatised services, no automatic extension of collective agreements signed in the public sector. So real problems of precarious work, low wage work, part-time work, predominantly undertaken by women, and really kind of fragmented responsibilities. So central government passing down the kind of the fiscal constraints onto local authorities, them in turn putting pressure on the market to cut costs, and nobody really taking responsibility. So it's a real kind of issue of fragmentation. So the response over maybe the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, has been to look at re-regulating some of those outsourced services, some of those supply chains, particularly for social care. And it hinges on a kind of innovation in a number of different domains, really. So trade unions have always been kind of pushing to prevent outsourcing, to bring services back in wherever they can, but they recognize they're in a very difficult position. So the kind of compromise has been to try and insert some labor clauses into those external contracts. So you can't extend collective agreements, you can't bring them back in, but you try and set some decent minimum standards. So the trade unions have been very active in campaigning to try and raise the standards among outsourced workers. So Unison, for example, has been very strong on the ethical care charter, which is around domiciliary care, trying to make a link between poor quality commissioning and poor quality working conditions. So very kind of public campaign, spreading far beyond their kind of core constituency, if you like, well into the private sector where they have very few members at all. Kind of ties in with the more general living wage movement, which has spread across cities, kind of across the US, across Europe, and across the UK. So it dovetailed in with other kind of local campaigns around living wages, but also on the kind of the public authorities side, they've got slightly more freedoms now, or they've been given some impetus to try and experiment with social value procurement. So it's a relaxation of the rules that prevented them from taking into account non-commercial considerations have been slightly relaxed in the last kind of 8-9 years. So they're becoming slightly more willing to experiment with these things. What can we do around minimum hours, guaranteed hours contracts? What can we do around hiring local workers? What can we do about training and development? So they're starting to experiment a little bit as well, particularly amongst wing and Labour control councils, they've kind of taken this agenda forward quite strongly. And you start to see it spreading across councils. So once you have a lead authority that pushes this, whether that's Manchester, Preston, or wherever, other councils start to follow suit. They see, well, it's practically possible, it can be done, it's legally possible. It also is good for the reputation of the local authority. It's something that we as a progressive local authority should be doing. So you start to see similar contracts and contract standards emerging and spreading across the sector, which I think is really interesting, how local authorities are kind of learning by imitation, if you like. They're starting to copy each other. The issue is that it's tended to remain a fairly localized solution. So it's done on a kind of contract by contract basis. It's where you have unions putting pressure, where you have political leaders kind of willing to do some of this, where you've got a responsive market as well, where providers are saying, yep, that's something we can incorporate, we can kind of collaborate on that. So it's tending to be quite a localized solution. It's not something that's been done in a coordinated way. The trade unions haven't been able to bring this together and say, well, let's extend the collective agreement to outsourced care workers. They've not had that kind of purchase to be able to do that. And I think a particular issue around the social value agenda is that it's very vague. So local authorities can say, yes, we do social value procurement, but when you look into it, it could be that they agree that contractors agree that they will hire 5 apprentices, or that they hire locally, or they make some kind of non-committal arrangement around training and development. So where you really want it to have an impact is kind of guaranteed hours contracts, career progression, living wages, those kind of big hitters, and that's not always happening. So there is certainly an issue there in terms of the kind of the coordination. So it's experimentation, but within very narrow boundaries. We haven't seen much in the way of insourcing that we thought we might. We were kind of hoping that this might be the watershed moment to start bringing services back in. When you've got such a weakly regulated market with such poor outcomes, why not bring it back in-house? We haven't really seen that. So it's not fundamentally changed the paradigm, if you like, around public sector outsourcing. It's just better regulating those supply chains once they go out to the market. So that's where we're kind of up to.
That's terrific, Matt, really, and provides an insight in a whole variety of tools and their limits, given the neoliberalization of public services and the commercial and contractual constraints introduced. So some of these ideas like social care charters and everything else, we understand the narrow boundaries of the experimentation, but experimentation nonetheless, from which we might have much to learn and which might be reproduced in other circumstances with different sets of market making constraints or facilitators. So why don't we go over to Valeria, and we'll ask her to pick up on her example and take us through a timeline and some of what's happened in terms of this second question of drawing on your research.
Yeah, thank you, Gregor. Well, unfortunately, I don't have a positive example, like an example of experimentalism or, kind of re-regulation as the kind of what Matt, in fact, has been kind of telling us. The reason simply probably because the research that I'm at the moment undertaking, particularly in these, I would say, specific areas of work like creative industries and platform economy, and to a certain extent also care, which cross also a lot across platform work, is in fact characterized very much by the emergence of forms of self-employment or marginal employment, if you like, where a lot of in fact of precarity occurs. And it's here that I want to perhaps link to what I was saying before, and I really see here the necessity of creating form of regulation and experimentalism. But as I said, unfortunately, there is not much. The reason why I say this is because what we see here in this particular industry is a really kind of degradation of working conditions. So there is really not much in terms of experimentalism, not yet. There is a lot of emergence of this unpaid work, which comes through, kind of really under forms, different forms of unpaid or underpaid as well activities, and which in fact sometimes is invisible or is kind of covered by discourses of employability, for example, which is a big kind of a strange of employability, because it's not the employability concept in economics, which says, we need to reorient people in the labor market. No, here is really, kind of proving yourself every day and trying to, to do your best. And it's here, in fact, that what I was mentioning before, this kind of blurring of the lines across or boundaries between home and work occurs. Because here, in fact, we see that people need a lot of resources. The state, the employers don't take responsibility for that. Actually, they have left people alone. And we see these, also across different schemes, income schemes. Now, just referring to the UK case with the universal credit system, but we could also look in Europe at other forms of, workfare in different ways. So people are left alone, and what do? They, in fact, go and look for resources in their own families. And we have a lot of examples in creative industries, in different kind of subsector, performing arts, TV and film, production, book and press in terms of journalism or whatsoever, but also in platform economy, both for, food delivery riders or Uber drivers or, online freelancers. So a lot of examples of people that, in fact, they rely on resources because they have to, in fact, prove themselves every day. How they do that, they are also under the pressure of creating reputation by themselves. And the resources that they get are the resources which come from the family, in fact, as I said before, mostly, because they don't have anything else they can rely on. And, these families, of course, have to support them, but also there is a lot of also kind of resources which come from themselves as well. Considering also the fact that, they have to find ways to cover, for example, for their own cost in terms of not only vans or bikes for delivery workers, but also, training, which normally should have be provided by employers. Now is not provided at all by them. So, all these kind of costs of production are externalized. So there is this kind of also externalization of cost of production, which goes very much into this unpaid activity. So, again, all these, as I said before, has a lot of implications for people, for their own families, because, in fact, impact upon the necessity. So it raises expectations, basically. People expect that, family members, by cross-subsidizing or, being responsible within the nuclear family to support them. And they ask for this kind of support. And sometimes what we see in the research, and there again, and this, necessity of experimentalism, that this kind of precarious work through unpaid is transferred through forms of inequalities across households, very much based on class concepts, and of course creates a lot of disturbance also in terms of gender inequalities, in terms of domestic work, because solutions need to be found, and these solutions are not provided by, again, neither employers nor the states. There is nothing there which can support. So I'm sorry to say, but yeah, I mean, there really there is probably a lot that still needs to be done. So, well, the data that we have been collecting so far, although with a lot of nuances, of course, across these work areas, but overall, they point to these. They point to the kind of private sphere of domestic work associated with the household and families, which is pressurized to take on roles that have previously been the responsibility of employers and the states. And this, of course, creates a lot of implications for change in family structures, for example. Just to say, a lot of example of kids, adult kids going and living with their own parents, but also parents going and living back to their own adult kids, because in fact these kids, they don't have the capacity to fulfill the care, for example, obligation that they should. So there is a lot of really disintegration also and precarity going this kind of public sphere of the area. And there, yeah, I would probably perhaps conclude by saying that, you know, capitalism, we might, well, I would not say that capitalism forgot about production, and but certainly is now eroding more and more this kind of public, and public and private sphere of work and life of people, and is in this kind of, you know, intersection that also a lot of experimentalism and re-regulation or new regulation, because in most of the cases we see also there is no regulation at all that is in fact needed, and hopefully, you know, we will have some to research in the future on these.
Brilliant, Valeria. Thanks so much. And I just want to point out for those who could not be in the first roundtable today that Matt speaking to social care was exactly picked up by Louise Boivin, who was talking about social care in the context of Quebec, that Valeria talking about the creative professions or about Uber platform workers exactly picks up what Philippe Barret and what Urbana Koiku were talking about. So there's a lot of connections to be made here. I don't know whether you'd like to come in at this point, Jim, with, and we gave you a free range mandate in saying if you weren't looking at a particular type of work, you could come in a free range way as befits your participation.
Free range, you make me sound like a chicken.
That's
Gregor.
right, that's right.
Okay.
And,
thank you. Well, let me refer to a natural experiment that I'm watching carefully. How's that? That's almost as good as a planned experiment. And it's a natural experiment that's both frightening and encouraging. And it relates to what we've all been obsessed with these last 15 months, which is the pandemic and how it has affected the conditions and security of work. There's a very interesting case study here, excuse me, in British Columbia, in the western end of Canada for our international guests, relating to people who work in the long-term care sector, so residential care facilities for older people, which of course around the world have been a horrible site for suffering and death from the COVID infections, including in Canada. 80% of all the COVID deaths in Canada occurred in long-term care facilities, and there's just a legacy of mismanagement and abuse and corporatization that have contributed to that massive failure. Now, an interesting dimension of it is the overlap between precarious work and the conditions of care. Like any other care industry, of course, the quality of care in aged care cannot be separated from the quality of work, because it is, again, human beings who are delivering that care hands-on to the people who need it. And because of the combination of austerity from governments and the profit motive within the private care industry, which is quite significant in Canada in aged care, we've seen a deterioration in the quality of work over the last generation, including a shift from permanent full-time jobs to various models of precarious work, including widespread use of labor staffing systems, labor hire agencies and others, to provide workers, especially, of course, for the personal care aides and cleaners and others at the lower end of the pay scale, but even for some allied health professionals and nurses and so on, being recruited through labor staffing systems instead of regular employment relationships. And the evidence is clear that that model contributed to the spread of COVID in aged care facilities for various reasons. One being, of course, workers in those precarious situations don't usually have normal entitlements such as sick pay. Another being when you work for a labor hire system or you're trying to piece together several different part-time jobs, you're often working in multiple sites. Well, lo and behold, that means not only could you bring COVID into one aged care facility, you could bring it into 3 aged care facilities, which has been just an absolute disaster. So I know this is a broader problem that various countries have experienced. I've been studying this in Australia as well as in Canada, but in British Columbia, there's been a unique kind of natural experiment. There's a progressive government here in British Columbia. This type of measure is the responsibility of the provincial government, not the national government. And this government moved very quickly in the early days of the pandemic to address that issue of precarious work in the long-term care sector, and immediately imposed a single site staffing arrangement whereby people were prohibited from working at more than one long-term care site as a way of limiting mobility amongst the different facilities. But then they had to back that up with something. You couldn't just say to somebody who was making a living out of 3 different jobs, you're only allowed to do one. So they also provided emergency funding for long-term care facilities, even the private ones, to hire all of their staff on a full-time basis at a union wage rate. There isn't a sectoral bargaining system per se, but they took the kind of benchmark union wage that was had been negotiated in some of the facilities, including the publicly owned facilities that make up a smaller share of the total industry, and then applied that to everyone working in the sector. That meant an enormous influx of public funds into the industry, including to subsidize the wages paid in private long-term care homes. And we could have a discussion about, how that shouldn't happen in the long run basis. But as an emergency response, it was powerful and well resourced, and it worked. We went from a situation where major deadly outbreaks were starting to occur in BC in the early weeks of the pandemic to shutting it down completely. And they limited the number of outbreaks quite significantly and successfully. So BC ended up with a much better experience in that dimension of the pandemic than, say, in Quebec, Gregor, or Ontario, where it just rolled on for months and months as an utter catastrophe. What comes next now is, the pandemic, we hope, is going to end in the next few months with vaccinations. What does that mean for our model of staffing in this kind of vital human care industry? And this is where it's up for debate. It's up for contest. In the ultimate, we would love to see long-term care reconstituted as part of the public healthcare system rather than having these privatized opportunities. We'd also like to use the kind of thin edge of the wedge that came from this particular experience to say, why don't we look at ways of stabilizing and regularizing employment relations across the whole sector, even if it isn't, completely nationalized, if you like, or brought within the public sphere. We could have a situation where we moved to a sector-wide collective bargaining type arrangement, as we see in other healthcare sectors or schools or construction and so on. It's not unprecedented, and this would be an opportunity to in a way, expand the foothold for sectoral bargaining or sectoral labor regulation structures, which, as you know, labor policy makers around the world are recognizing has to be part of a progressive solution to improving the quality of these jobs. So this is a natural experiment, but an important one, encouraging what the results were, saddening the context for the results and that experiment. But we'll be watching closely and obviously participating with the trade union in that sector, the Health Employees Union, as it's known here in BC, and other advocates to try to make the most of what has been a disastrous situation. You're on mute.
Yeah, we're back now. Very interesting and a really good example of experimentation, and somehow the state is there. And if you'll just allow me to introduce a brief parenthesis here, and for those who you don't know, Jim is Canada's improvement on Paul Krugman. So there is currently a horror discourse ambient, which is, and for John Peters, who's on the line here, currently in Newfoundland, the Green Report of saying, we're all going to hell in a handbasket because the public sector can never support all these radical ideas of having full-time jobs in the care sector, and we'll never be able to have affordable daycare in the public system. What's your answer to this, Jim? Just so that we are reassured that because it's really a lot. What we're getting right now is a lot like Ontario at the beginning of the Ray government in the in the 1990s of saying, you have to shoot the hippopotamus.
Well, first of all, thank you, Gregor, for that very flattering comparison to Paul Krugman. I'll just wait for my Nobel Prize to arrive in the mail any day. It's an interesting moment this time in history to rethink about fiscal policy and what the kind of traditional common sense wisdom had been about what is and isn't possible. Again, forced by disastrous circumstances, governments moved mountains over the last 15 months in ways that in the past people would have said, that just isn't feasible. Well, it was feasible. And governments, in fact, are the only force in society that has the authority, the ability to act on a national scale, and the unlimited financial resources to mobilize resources in that way. For a while, the kind of traditional denizens of the wisdom of austerity were silent. It was not popular in the middle of the pandemic to come out and say government's too big, we have to cut it back and get government out of the way, when everyone realized government was, saving our collective asses, if I can put it that way. Now they're coming back out of the woodwork. How effectively and quickly they'll be able to roll back the boundaries of what's considered acceptable fiscal policy remains to be seen. The reality is national governments can run big deficits for many, many years if need be. Japan's debt is 250% of GDP, and they've had no financial crisis, and they haven't been restrained in responding to COVID either. Their COVID response package has been as big as other countries. On the other hand, we are going to see pushback. In Canada's case, it's coming on Monday with the budget in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is one of the hardest pressed provinces. And a subnational government obviously has less flexibility. But we are going to see hard-nosed plan for austerity coming in Newfoundland, and we'll have to be ready to resist it there and everywhere else we see it. This will be a historic battle over the next 5 years or so to see whether we get back to austerity as usual in the wake of this moment, or whether we can permanently shift how people see fiscal policy and fiscal options.
Thank you, Jim, and apologies to the other panelists, but I'm sure you'll agree that the question of austerity and its link to good jobs is clearly linked to some of the observations you're making. So that's a local concern, which is, I think, quite generalized across most of our political economies. Over to you, Olga, to take your example of how you want to move through some kind of re-regulation, backstroke experimentation, and to look at the implications of what was happening.
Okay, is my mic working better this time?
Much better, thanks.
Much better. Okay, I've managed to switch mics, that's great. Yeah, what I wanted to pick up on was a piece of work that we were doing looking at the tensions between productivity demands in an organisation and how organisations manage their health and well-being of their workers. And this had started actually in 2019, and then of course COVID hit. And what I want to pull out for today's, to feed in with what the other panelists too are saying, is just looking at some of the lessons that we've tried to glean from an education organisation and from a construction firm about what happened to those tensions and what happened to whether work got worse or better in that context. So it becomes, perhaps I'm looking at this among micro level, I'm looking at what happens in the organisational context and how that might be shaping the nature of work. And I'd say we set up these interviews with a lot of companies, but we ended up getting in January. And then on the 23rd of March in the UK, we went into national lockdown. And that meant for the schools that we were working with, it was an educational trust with 4 schools, around 150 workers, school teachers, and they immediately went home. And the signals very much there were, your health is important to us, your well-being is important to us. And for the first time, that got a primacy, I suppose, over other concerns. And the workers at that point felt, yeah, we hear the concerns, our interests are coming to the fore. But that quickly shifted, because then we had huge concerns about the welfare of children. We had about their learning progression, about their mental health. There was a lot of campaigns in national media coming at looking at disadvantaged young people. And there was a lot of pressures from different directions, actually. I think the Marcus Rashford campaign on poverty and the health of young children was putting the primacy again on the health of the child. And it got to a point where a lot of the teachers would have felt the health of the child was more relevant than the health of the teacher in the classroom. And the teachers were in a situation where they had to work. So they were designated key workers. They were back in the workplace, and they were looking after the key workers of the health workers, and they were looking after vulnerable children. At the same time, they were going entirely remote learning. And what that meant is there was really very little attention to the pedagogy of learning. It was very much you take your classroom and you send it home with the children. So the parents become the teachers, yet they're unqualified. They were running timetables that sat very much with an in-school type timetable. And the spillover was that there was a lot of anxiety and anger among parents. There was extreme anxiety amongst teachers about their own health, how they were coping, the technology and the upskilling they had to do, and the lack of resources, the lack of PPE, the lack of financial resources, the lack of protection. Now, on the face of it, teaching would be one of those professions that actually has better work, because it has a degree of autonomy, it has a degree of sense of meaning and purpose. It has all of those qualities I talked about, although you probably couldn't hear at the beginning. But the context they were in, the resources that they had, and how those resources were being managed by the school management and by government was actually deteriorating the quality of their work during that 4-month lockdown period, and since we've been with the company since. They've had a lot of concerns and issues. Now, we contrasted that with the construction firm, where the quality of work would traditionally be seen as much poorer quality. We know from the sector, we've worked with the sector a long time, and you will be very aware yourselves that this is a sector where it's male dominated. There are a lot of health problems within this workforce. There's obesity problems, there's heart problems. Much of that is down to the nature of the work. It's transient work, it's heavy duty physical work. It's very disruptive to family life. There's high divorce rates. There's high suicide rates amongst the young men in this population. So they have a lot of issues around this workforce that would affect the health and well-being of that workforce. At the same time, though, the construction firm performed extremely well. And some of that was to do with, we have the Health and Safety Executive in the UK, which is a regulatory body that is focused on, obviously, safety in critical or high critical risk environments, where it's the actual physical safety of individuals gets priority. And of course, in a construction environment, that takes primacy. But they were very well geared up for then taking on board the mental health and relational issues. And they have done that with, again, a lot of campaigns in the UK. And they're at the forefront of some of the mechanisms they have in terms of mental health first aiders, partnership working, the involvement of the unions, the provision they have, and EAP, and so actual counselling and physical, real resources and investment behind the mental health of workers as well as the physical health. Having all that in place meant when they went into lockdown, and they were able to adjust and rebalance the interests as time progressed. So they did make mistakes. They had the all work at home campaign for office workers, but of course site workers had to be on the site, particularly for critical work. And that led inadvertently to a kind of them and us attitude. We're disposable workers, you're looking after one set, not the other. So then they readjusted the provision, hearing that, because they had mechanisms for picking up that unsettlement, that anxiety, and ways of correcting it. So putting in compensation benefits that were well beyond what the UK government was putting in terms of self-isolating. So you didn't come to work if you had a positive test, which again, Jim talked about how that proliferation of the virus amongst workers that can't afford to maybe self-isolate. So they were trying to prevent a lot of that, putting in other compensation to encourage people to do the right thing and stay at home, and additional PPE safety, which often went beyond what the school actually had, and the school in that public sector arena, but construction in a very private sector arena. So we've been looking at those issues, and I think coming above that, trying to understand the kind of institutional work that's happening around authenticity in the workplace that might help explain how those interests balance, rebalance, and change as the dynamic changes. So I'll maybe stop there.
And if I can just ask you, Olga, and that's terrific, when you say authenticity in the workplace, what do you mean?
Yeah, very much about how employees interpret and perceive the messages that they're getting about whether their health and their well-being is actually really taken as a priority, and that follows through. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does the employer walk the talk?
Yeah.
Okay. No, great. Now, some of you will know that we've sought to build through this roundtable a first question of just saying, okay, tell us a bit about a particular kind of case that you're interested in, you're working on, and what it means to have a better or worse job, and then working through a case of re-regulation or experimentation. And we've just seen in the case of Olga, for example, the contrast that she was able to make between teachers and construction workers with perhaps surprising results for many people, except those who are in the education sector and know it well, and everything that they've been dealing with recently. Matt was able to take us in an area very interesting about experiments around social care charters. Valeria was a little less optimistic, but nonetheless really driving home the work-family connections. And Jim was very interesting on the long-term care in BC, and how a number of market regulation aspects helped, at least over the COVID period, with really significant collateral effects in terms of overall health of the population, unlike Quebec and British Columbia. Were able to set a series of regulations which really helped to improve jobs and also had tremendous productivity and health benefits for the province as a whole. Now, we've been developing this framework, and it's co-constructed with lots and lots of researchers that say, when we want to think about better or worse work, there are a certain number of dimensions that you need to think about. And one is about economic and social risk. And you've highlighted these aspects in significant ways. And of course, always when you talk about economic and significant risk, you can also think, well, who's assuming that risk? Valeria says, well, it's the families in some respects. Or is it racialized immigrant workers who are assuming the risk and others are not having it? We also talk about autonomy and control, which are such significant aspects of being satisfied with your jobs. And many people are talking about how technology is reducing margins for autonomy and control. These are issues that are significant. Others can see that technology might be an enabler. And then the third aspect is around what we call expressiveness, and that's really about voice. But I think that it's also been suggested you look at some kinds of jobs, and Olga mentioned, for instance, teachers who have the inherent aspects of their job where there's meaning, there's a sense of influencing things for the positive, there's a sense of having a positive impact on the community, which naturally should contribute to the quality of expressiveness, as well as the very basic things like access to collective representation and an ability to make a difference in the community, all of which have knock-on effects for the jobs. So I think what we're asking you here, and we have to put together the third and the fourth questions that we have, is when you look at this framework, are there particular aspects that we should be retaining? What's important, and what are a couple of the takeaways that when thinking about your research, you want to highlight for thinking about how we might go about experimenting for better jobs, as well as, of course, understanding why jobs can become worse in the context of some types of experimentation. So with this big command, over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Gregor. I suppose probably the biggest area, or the strongest area, I think, where has come through the work that we've been doing is definitely the financial risk. The financial risk of being in a poor quality job with poor wages, with not enough hours, with limited opportunities to progress. And the point that Jim raised as well about people working multiple jobs. So I guess it's that transfer of risk, isn't it? It's the risk of non-continuous demand being pushed down the line. So to me, that kind of speaks to the bridge between the product market and the labour market. It's not one of those things in isolation. It's how those two things interrelate. So you can see that very clearly in the case of outsourced social care, which sounds like quite a parochial example, but you can see how the failure to guarantee and stabilize demand in the kind of delivery of that service has a direct knock-on effect to the wages and working conditions. So individual workers are having to either work very, very long hours with unpaid breaks to make enough to get by. The work is kind of intermittent because client numbers aren't guaranteed. Contracts are fixed term, or they're temporary agency, or they're otherwise precarious. Or even if you have got a permanent job, notionally a permanent job, you could be working for a contractor that's up for renewal and they don't get that contract. So what happens to you then? So there's kind of a number of different uncertainties and risks that come through that system. And I think looking at those two things in tandem, what are we doing around kind of regulating the service, the product market, how these things are kind of funded and constructed, has a direct implication for the working arrangements that people experience and the individual risks that they shoulder. And I think we're potentially kind of storing up major problems for people who are working on low wage, part-time, insufficient hours contracts, because we saw that with the pandemic. They hadn't accrued enough for sick pay, to self-isolate. They kind of were storing up major problems with pensions because people haven't contributed enough to the state pension, or even to a private pension if they're one of the lucky ones that might be entered into a private pension. All of these kind of risks are kind of being pushed onto the individual. So I think the financial risk and the social risk and the personal risk is absolutely essential.
Terrific, Matt, and I guess in thinking about this risk scenario, I guess we could ask you easily, is the takeaway one of public policy which alleviates risk and enables transition strategies so that you're less attached to a single job, but more to a career trajectory. So, the much vaunted Danish system where the social support for transition is significant versus a Canadian system where we try and get as much seniority as possible to connect with particular jobs. And there are merits in each system, but I'm thinking in relation to what you're saying in this risk, is it really about social support coming from the state? Or are there other forms of mutualism that you can develop which will help people in these contexts?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both. I mean, certainly in the UK, I don't think anybody's expecting a transition to a Nordic style welfare system. Although there are some, obviously, the kind of the furlough scheme and job retention, it can be done. You can make investments in social protection without kind of bankrupting the country, as Jim mentioned. I think what's interesting is that there's been some discussion of things like universal basic income. That's the way to kind of liberate people. It's the way to provide a minimum floor under people's kind of living standards. But my issue with that is that it takes the employers out of the equation. So I think it needs to make sure that employers are still contributing, whether that's through paying a living wage, whether it's through pension arrangements, whether it's through other kind of accrued rights that workers access. I think the focus on making sure employers are contributing still to the system is absolutely critical. So I don't think it's sustainable, or I'm not sure it's a good idea to look at this purely in terms of social protection and what the state can do, but certainly making sure there's incentives, there are obligations on employers that they're still paying in some form.
Did you want to say something on that, Jim, without me yet asking you the last question? I saw you lean forward in a way that was portentous.
No, I'm saving my powder here, Gregor.
Okay, it's dry on the West Coast, which already is a surprising turn of events. Olga, can we draw you into this next question of the different dimensions of what might be better work and some of the takeaways from your work in thinking about this?
Yeah, sorry, my mouse is just chasing around my multiple screens. Yes, I think there was a couple of takeaways from the work we've done so far. I think this notion of, or this concern about individualization of risk, and we see it very much in the teaching context. When we talk about, or when the teachers themselves and the management within that context talk about resilience, they talk about it in terms of being the responsibility of the employee. When you look at the construction organization, they don't. It's a collective. They see organizational resilience, and they understand that it's part of the organization's remit to look after and to support employees in various aspects of health and well-being and how the work is done to keep the workforce sustainable long term. I'm not saying that the organizations are perfect, but I think there's a strong recognition that actually resilience it has to happen at the leadership organizational level, and how that connects with public policy. Whereas at the educational level, they just couldn't understand how to do that. The sort of a recognition it needed to be done, but what they couldn't see the levers or how. And that meant everything about resilience was it's your responsibility to deal with the workload and the intensification and everything that's coming down the line. And that's just really scary. So that there's that kind of personalization aspect and individualization. I think the other thing, again, I think is a nice message and perhaps picks up on intersectionalities again and going forward with better work. We saw it in the construction and in a number of other firms. It's about individual identity and how bringing your identity into the workplace is really fundamental to making the workplace a better place to be and to not only work, but to live. And here that there's been some profound movements around gender and LGBT communities in particular. And we saw that also in construction. And we know how not dealing with issues arising from the LGBT community actually has negative effects on employee health and well-being. And therefore they're really grappling with that, and there's seismic movements and some of that. So I think again, that intersectionality of identity, personal values, and those external lobbyists and movers that help shape what an organization's responsibility is within that working domain.
That's really fascinating, Olga, and it won't surprise you as well. Olga is also a specialist in HRM, and we hear in that respect some of the new HRM, but also thinking about why you can't bring values in, and why you cannot think of work as something which is liberating, which for people who are not living in that atmosphere probably seems hallucinogenic for many workers, and yet this is what's being done on one side of the pad. Valeria, it would be great to hear the conclusions you're drawing, however bleak they might be, or you might surprise us and be just a font of optimism on the basis of thinking about better work and how you do it.
Yes, well, I'm sorry I have to disappoint you, Gregor.
Oh, no, it won't be a disappointment.
But yeah, I mean, it was also a revelation for me to dig into these new areas of work and to see how much desperation really people are facing and how much they've been facing, particularly during the COVID period, is unbelievable. But anyhow, one thing I would certainly agree also with Olga and Matt to what he said about, you know, particularly Olga, the issue of intersectionality. I think this is an important issue, and I think it needs to be tackled much more seriously if we want to understand, in fact, about good and bad jobs. So I think we need to really take it to understand, in fact, what is happening. And what I would say linked into that is, again, when we think about control, and in fact, you're right, Gregor, when you pointed out, the issue of technology linked to control, and there are different positions. Also, there is not only control on work, is also control on life of people. And again, the question is, how do you balance the two, but also how you make trade-off between the two. And we are back into what I was also mentioning at the very beginning. And again, our data at the very moment, the research we are undertaking points these very much into attention, particularly when you are dealing in these kind of new forms of work, but also traditional forms of work, where you see these really happening very much. So if you want to understand control, you need to also bring that dimension back in. And that's why, because as I said before, and I strongly believe it, and now it's not, I don't want to kind of being the ghost, but I really think that as also other particularly gender feminist scholars have been highlighting, really neoliberalism is really, as Nancy Fraser says, is eating much more at the roots of our social bonds. And we need to really understand how this is happening, what are the mechanisms, what are the processes, what are the dynamics, which are complete, really much more interlinked to the world of production and work that we probably have never ever thought about. And I also want to draw here some consideration from an institutionalist perspective, also political economy, because as Matt says, and I fully agree, if we see now that employers are retreating very, very quickly from their own responsibilities, and this is going to happen more and more in the future. The question we should pose from a more industrial relations institutionalist perspective is, to what extent could we believe that, the kind of typologies of market economies we have been kind of talking about, particularly the coordinated market economies, I talk from a Belgian perspective, to what extent these will still be there within 10 and 20 years from now onwards. Why do I say this? Because, these kind of economies have been built upon, particularly the coordinated, on the kind of support and responsibility of employers making compromises with trade unions and the state in, trying to, again, take over their own responsibility. Now, if these responsibilities are shifting out from their own area of competencies, then I don't know what is going to happen. And I think digitalization should let us thinking much more in that respect. So this, also is something that probably we should kind of take into consideration and develop research on that, how this typology will be transformed even more. And on the side of the voice that you mentioned, I think there, I really do think also there is the identity Olga mentioned. I also do believe the agency and voice will still and certainly be important. I expect agency particularly to be important. Identity formation, so I agree with Olga, also will play an increasingly important role in the way in which we look at bad and good jobs. And here I want to just close with a small example regarding this. Now, in our work on the platform economy, which is a bit bizarre to a certain extent, but also interesting to see, freelancers on online platforms, at least, the ones we have been researching till now, are actually showing much more agency than what we would have expected. I mean, they are the ones that they are, in fact, bringing their own agency as being freelancers and creating in that respect resistance vis-a-vis the kind of practices, mispractices that platforms they do when they don't treat them as freelancers. So these people want to be treated as freelancers and they want to really be recognized as such. And this is, I think, a wonderful example of how these people bring their own professionality and identity and they try to build upon that. That could be a good example of experimentalism into, in the way how they shape their own, or they try to shape their own work conditions. And I would stop here.
I think, Valeria, that's a very important point. One that I think Martine Damour was also arguing yesterday in her H.D. Woods lecture of the flexibility of platforms. But the same token, people don't necessarily want to leave all aspects of that flexibility. So it really needs to be unpacked and understood in complex ways. I often use the example of restructured steelworkers in China now working in the platform economy, and they don't necessarily want to go back to the steelworking job, if you see what I mean, because there were all kinds of aspects that they like of their new jobs, and of course there are aspects that they don't like. So it's not a straight less risk, more control, more expressiveness, which is a plus, but it's going to be more complicated than that. And I think that what you're arguing and what we had in the first roundtable highlight this. Now, we're going to have one more presentation. That he's just ensuring that the powder is dry. But I want to emphasize, I think that we've made the transition in this roundtable that people will be able to put up their hand and they could actually speak. And we'll take several comments on the round table for those who feel so moved, and those who want to simply do a question answer response. We can also see this, but it would be great if we can actually enable people to speak and have a voice. We'll see that after Jim's presentation. So do you want to bring this around, Jim, for your thinking on the different dimensions of better and worse work, and a couple of takeaways that you might see with this respect?
Sure, Gregor, thank you. And I'm right on with where Valeria was going on this whole issue of so-called flexibility and so-called autonomy, and the need to unpack that. I guess, Gregor, in terms of the framework that you described at the beginning, I think there's a very interesting tension between the first dimension of economic and social risk and who bears it, and then the second dimension about autonomy and control, and how those two things are connected in very complicated ways. And you're right, it isn't a one-dimensional spectrum or line where you've got control at one side and autonomy on the other side. There's all kinds of different ways, even in how the term autonomy or flexibility is used. We've been following obviously like others, the debate about gig work and whether people are defined as employees or not, and the companies' responses to the political and regulatory constraints that they're starting to face all over the world. And their go-to position time after time after time is to say these jobs are flexible and the workers doing them love the flexibility. And this is a powerful ideological device. It's total bullshit, if I can use the technical term in economics, but it is one that they are invoking over and over again. And we've done a bit of survey work with gig workers and a bit of thinking and sort of analysis of the documentation that the gig companies themselves put out in their investment prospectuses and their regulatory submissions and so on. And what I think is often disguised as flexibility, the ability to work when you want to work, actually means the ability to work, period. For the groups of marginalized, desperate workers that are the fodder for the gig economy's workforce. Think about who's doing rideshare and who's delivering fast food and who's doing the other jobs. By and large, they are people who don't have access to other roles in the labor market that might be more appealing. Maybe not an old-fashioned steel factory, but other jobs that are more secure and more stable. And this is where, again, the false dichotomy between security and flexibility really has to be unpacked. Workers want both and deserve both. Here's an example. One of the Australian companies, it's Uber Eats actually, in a submission to a Senate inquiry in Australia into their work practices, actually conducted their own survey. Of course, we don't know exactly how the survey was conducted. It was contracted, and we don't have full access to the data or the methodology and so on. But the survey showed that a majority of their workers did not have access to other forms of paid employment, which was a tacit admission that they're reaching workers, by and large immigrant students. This is where the main workforce is in Australia, who are allowed to work, but only up to a certain cap of hours in Australia. And that, moreover, these people couldn't do other jobs because of immigration constraints. Well, that was a tacit admission by Uber Eats that a good chunk of their workforce is working for them illegally, because there's no visa in the system that says you can't do a wage job, but you can do a gig job. That doesn't exist. So they are acknowledging what we all knew, that these people are working effectively under the table. Moreover, Uber Eats celebrated the fact that their workers could not qualify, most of them, 78% in their survey, could not qualify for government income supports during the COVID pandemic, which also reflects the fact that they, by and large, didn't have the immigration status, which under Australia's racist system, immigrant and migrant workers were often excluded from. But Uber Eats is making this a positive. You know, they're really making a silk purse out of a sow's ear on this one, celebrating the fact that they found this way to tap into an extremely desperate, unprotected segment of society, who then are happy to work for less than minimum wage. You know, and this is a debate really that's as old as wage labor. You could always find a situation where people were happy to work for less than minimum wage because they didn't know what else to do. In this regard, I think there's a very important task for us to challenge this idea of flexibility. You know, if you ask a gig worker, are you glad you can turn off the job and go and do your homework when you need to? Sure. But does that mean you have to work for minimum wage? Not remotely. There's all kinds of jobs in the labor market where people have flexibility to turn down shifts when they can't do it for various reasons, in all kinds of roles: hospitality, retail, warehousing, office work, etc. So, you know, this false identification of precarity with flexibility, I think, is one that deserves a lot of attention from both researchers and advocates, and it's one that we're following. And I think it shows that the three dimensions of the framework that you described, Gregor, are very helpful, but the lines between them are very blurry, as you well know. And you know, exploring those interactions, I think, will be very, very fruitful.
Terrific, Jim, and a way to bring forward the what we call the template with a capital T, to as a way, and our frustration with much of the work is being done is that people publish and then perish, or publish and don't perish. But there's very little way of aggregating all of these different studies. And what we're trying to do is to bring a way to get research results, not to stop people from doing the other stuff that they need to do for whatever reason, but to bring these different kinds of studies together in a way that they can dialogue. And therefore saying, okay, well, there's certain things that are happening to work. How do we understand that? How can we make the connections with this? This is the idea of the frustration with current models of aggregation, which is almost like genuflection when you write something in an academic journal and then you quote all the other things, but it's not really connecting in a way that helps you to aggregate our understanding, and notably in interaction with actual actors in the labor market who are thinking about these things as well. So the idea of the partnership is trying to bring all of this into connection. Not easily done, but an ambition. Now, we have a few minutes left. And if you put up your hand amongst the people in the audience, and the people in the panel have always been asking questions, so now you can ask questions of others as well. Of course, we can jump off early, but I think that we have such richness here. And I'm just trying to see that with the technical support that I am going to be able to see the hands ups and anyone who's put up their hand. But I don't see any images, so you're going to be enabled to speak by the technical support coming from the Faculté des Sciences Sociales at Laval. So is anyone putting up their hand? I do have a hand here somewhere, and I just have to find it, I think.
You can click on participant. at the bottom of your screen, and you will be able to see who has their hand raised. So we have John Peters. I will just
Okay, no, if you can let John Peters speak, and we won't necessarily take a whole lot of responses to each question, but what we'll do is we'll get several people to contribute, and then we'll get a last go round. So go ahead, John. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say hello to Jim and Valeria, since I don't get to see you very often. So hello. So it's always great to see you. And I definitely and hello to Matt and Olga and Gregor. Big question that we haven't dealt with: power. If things are going to hell in a handbasket, that's always been my opinion about it. And we're going to get better work. How are we going to go about changing that? And and I ask this, I think, because I think many people have been impressed and amazed that we've seen governments actually act for public good over the past year in terms of the COVID pandemic. We've seen the emergence in Canada, of a Canadian emergency relief benefit, as well as wage subsidies. Things that we would have, I would have never dreamed of ever seen in Canada. We've seen them pass. But this said, of course, we all know the experience from the financial crisis, where after a couple of years of financial support, the discourse changed almost immediately, and the problem was overspending. And then we saw massive, job layoffs across the public sector. We saw changes to, labor laws and labor and employment regulations. And of course, we've seen, the vast expansion now, of different kinds of platform work, temporary foreign work, zero-hour contracts, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering, do you have any examples? I mean, Jim, you mentioned about BC, but are there other examples either in Europe or in England or in the UK or elsewhere to say that, do we see workers or do we see coalitions and do we see movements that are going to push for a new deal that's going to come out of this crisis? And I think that's a big question, because I don't think we want to see a rerun of the financial crisis. Are there actual elements that you're seeing that would give you hope or some optimism to say that, there's people are moving and people are wanting better work? They want, a clean economy. They want better social services. Is there anything that you're seeing that would lead to have some sort of optimism on those grounds?
And if you can just hold your ideas on this for a second, and it's a fantastic question, and let's point out for solidarity and other purposes that John's current past working conditions are subject to those of other creditors in a bankruptcy proceedings at Laurentian University, where his employment has been terminated. So power is a relevant question here as well, in a narrow way, but also in a broader way. So thank you, John. And Matthew Dupuis has a question, and he asked it, but I'd really like him to voice it if he could, and if you could activate Matthew's Dupuis' microphone, Geneviève.
Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, my question was related to the important issue that Jim raised. It's the balance between flexibility and stability. And it remembers me what Judy Fudge argued a couple of years ago, that we need social rights that are disentangled from an employer, from the market. But how do you build these social rights? Do you give them to the state? And it remembers me also in all the quote from Samuel Gompers that what the state doesn't give, it can take it away. I don't know if it's the right quote, but you understand the quote. So do we need to think about the state as a social right giver, or to organize it on a more local or regional level with workers and union and social groups?
Great question, Matthew. Very interesting. And Matt immediately knows he's in the right forum when he hears questions like that one. I think that what we'll do, unless I see someone else with their hand up, we can then have a go around both on these questions and anything else that you want to conclude the session on. So who'd like to go first rather than me selecting you? Everyone at once, that's good. Olga, thank you.
I'll jump in because I'm sure the others might have more extended responses. I mean, this isn't, we're both really, really interesting questions and about future directions and what we might see coming up. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is because we've got the devolved governments in the UK, Welsh government and Scottish government are really pushing ahead on different agendas to England, and perhaps because their size and the issues that they have in those regions will allow them to do that. And I think that can be quite really experimental and creative. I'm not sure what's going to happen though. So Welsh government, for example, have really picked up on the green economy, and they are tying in a cleaner, healthier environment, cleaner jobs, less air pollution into absolutely everything around their transport systems, their educational systems, the types of jobs they want to create, the types of industry they have, and how their industry are moving to zero carbon. So there's a big push at that policy level, and as to what will happen, I don't know, but I think it's an interesting space because they are looking very much at intersectionalities. Scotland are taking a space-based approach to its innovations. They have such huge health inequalities and a lot of problems that have never really been addressed in terms of drug use and death and a lot of problems around the health system. And they feel that actually the way these can be resolved is looking at the geography and the cluster of all the multiple stakeholders in that region and that area that are dealing with education, jobs, public policy support, public health. It's a very different model to Wales, and again, very different model to England. So I think actually there's a lot of interest probably in the UK of looking at the different regional models for how we might approach things and that experimentation within the UK. I'll maybe hand over to others.
And I think, Olga, that regional dimension of experimentation, and a number of people have been picking up on this, for example, Janice Fine in the US and her colleagues in looking at enforcement of labor standards and how it's being picked up, even in municipal and regional forums in different ways, are saying, this is how you build the future. You have to construct it in one locality at a time. Maybe that's the ideal entry point for Matt.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Olga's saying there. I think there is that scope for devolved decision making to push this agenda forward. Now, I guess there's a question as to whether that then becomes a fundamental social right, or it's a right at work. It's a right that kind of regulates the market in some way, shape or form. So the idea that people have a right to a decent job, or they have a right to a living wage, or a right to, kind of safe and secure working conditions, for example. I suppose it's maybe a semantic issue as to whether that becomes a social right, but I think certainly in terms of rights at work, that's exactly where you can do it. You can do it where you've got a place-based approach, you've got the decision making, you've got the political will, you can negotiate quite directly and frequently with employers to bring them along with you that the national government struggles to do, or certainly in the UK doesn't have the inclination to do that. So I think it's at the local level where you can make some progress in terms of rights at work. Now, whether that's enhancing them, whether it's protecting existing ones, it will vary from place to place. I think the point about power is interesting. I think it's maybe it requires quite a nuanced understanding of power, doesn't it? The different forms of power resources that different institutional actors have. And I think maybe where trade unions have made some progress or have had some successes is on the kind of ideational power. They've been putting forward some big agendas, big ideas that do seem to resonate with people. So when you're talking about decent work, you're talking about fair work, you're talking about decarbonisation, just transitions, unions have been involved with that, and people do respond to it. People see the kind of value of it. I guess the problem is that the structural power, the associational power has been kind of whittled away over a long period. So what leverage do trade unions or other social actors actually have to make that happen is another issue, I guess.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Valeria, did you want to come in on this? Or Jim? Whoever comes first. Valeria.
Yeah, well, thanks. I would like to take a European perspective here. What we see in Europe at the very moment is well, we see a little bit of movement actually now. Whether this movement will land into kind of increasing rights for workers, we don't know. But there has been a lot of attention at the very moment, also from the side of the European Parliament, and there is, in fact, at the very moment, a kind of attempt to revise, for example, Directive on Information and Consultation, European Works Council Directive. There has been a kind of a discussion around that. Now we will see what will happen in the future, but there is something there. There is also at the very moment in Europe a kind of discussion on the draft directive on platform work, which is quite interesting, and a lot of attention also what will come out of it. And this is, of course, also the results of a lot of battles and fighting around, particularly on, I want to emphasize here, digital work across different countries in Europe. My country, particularly Italy, has been quite important there, and unions have been quite strong. And I would say here, formal unions, not all independent unions, really formal traditional unions, CGL, chisel and will, really at the kind of confederal level, then we go down. So in other words, they've been able really to negotiate the algorithm. We have in Italy an interesting case of now platform workers, food delivery workers who have been actually recognized the rights to be included into a specific sector and collective bargaining into the logistics sector. So I mean, I think that on that side, now going back to the point that John was raising, I think do we see coalition movements pushing for better jobs? We see something moving, and I would say that yes. Well, on the question of Matthew, I would say probably it's both. I would, from my perspective, is social rights. Both provided by the state, but also, taking this kind of aspect that was mentioned by Matt and Olga, more kind of bottom up. But I would see as being both aspects, and certainly, I would emphasize that. And I stop here.
And over to you, Jim.
Well, thanks, John and Matthew, for the questions. And John, nice to connect with you again. It's just appalling what's happened at Laurentian. So my solidarity to you and all the other colleagues. That's a shock doctrine form of austerity at that university, and one that we have to defeat or it will spread. John asked about power, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we did learn from the GFC. We all sat back and kind of thought, well, capitalism is going to collapse of its own accord and get ready for the phoenix to rise from the ashes. And that isn't how change occurs. In fact, ironically, after the GFC, the powers of austerity were strengthened, even though it was their fault. So it is all about power and force and who can mobilize and how. And, if I look out at the world, it's a mixed bag. There are examples of where movements are happening, and there's examples where people are kind of flat-footed because of the pandemic. It's hard to get together. People are afraid and isolated. So, that is the challenge of how do we build unified, ambitious movements that can defend what we have and win some of what we need to win. Matthew's point about the tension between employer-provided and state-provided and community-organized social protections is really, really important and really complicated, and I don't have a short answer. The resources and reach of the state, obviously, make it in some ways the first go-to place in terms of providing something that's universal and reliable, and so that's why we're looking for things like pharmacare provided through the state, for example, rather than through employer-linked benefits packages. Because so many people are missing out on those employer-linked ones. On the other hand, Matthew's point is also valid that the states willingness to provide those benefits is obviously always contested, and it can be taken away as surely as it is given. A good example of that tension is the debate we're having around paid sick leave for workers in Canada. Everybody recognizes we have to have some kind of paid sick leave. It's appalling that the statutory requirements on that are almost non-existent in Canada, and the pandemic reminded us why. It's to all of our benefit that people have the right to stay home when it's important to do so. Then that does open a question: who pays for that? And I think that some folks say, well, it should be employers. They're the ones who are, really should be responsible for allowing their workers to stay home. On the other hand, the state can provide it on a more universal basis, and the cost of this benefit is significant, particularly for obviously smaller businesses, which are in jeopardy anyways because of the pandemic. So there's been a very interesting debate amongst advocates of sick pay, how much of it, if any of it, should be provided by the state. And in Canada's case, we've got the EI sick benefit and some of the COVID specific benefits that were designed, and very little on the shoulders of employers. So that's just a good example of a debate that is going to continue. In a way it's secondary. The key point is to win the battle that you have to have the right to stay home, and then we'll figure out how to pay for it. But of course they do go together. So thanks for those questions and for the whole panel, Gregor. Wonderful stuff.
And in turn, I want to thank Olga Tregaskis in not in Norwich perhaps, but a village somewhere beyond Norwich. Matt Johnson, presuming in Manchester, though we never know exactly where people are. Valeria Pulignano, who I think is in Leuven today, and Jim Stanford, who is in Vancouver. I think we've had a fascinating panel here, and you add this panel to the previous one that we had from 8:30, and you have something which is very rich and on which we want to build to try and aggregate this understanding of putting the normative dimension of better work at the center of our thinking rather than anything else, that this is what's important. And I think that this is what's motivating everyone you've heard from today. So that is terrific. We need to give a few minutes in the transition over to the annual general meeting of the Canadian Industrial Relations Association. That's for members, I believe, though they're always glad to have new members. But what it means is that the access was sent to CIRA members this morning. So you have to go into that email that you got about the CIRA general meeting to find the Zoom access. For everyone else in Europe and the UK, however it's defined, have a good evening. Jim, a good rest of the day. And thank you all. It's been terrific. We'll be in touch.
Thank you, Gregor. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Gregor.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.